Объект Садатайс.
Good morning, colleagues. The sitting is open. I will start with the announcement of the results of yesterday's second voting session. The results of the second voting session of Wednesday, 9th of March are as follows. Report by Irena Tenagli, European Semester Annual Sustainable Growth Survey 2022. Amendment number 11, approved. Number 12, rejected. Number 13, rejected. Number 1, rejected. Number 2, rejected. Number 14, rejected. Number 15, rejected. Number 3, rejected. Number 16, rejected. Number 4, rejected. Number 5, rejected. Amendment number 6, rejected. Article 18, first part adopted, second part adopted. Third part adopted. Article 19, approved. Amendment number 7, approved. Recital A, approved. Amendment number 8, approved. Number 9, approved. And amendment number 10, approved as well. Next, report by Helmut Goiking, European Semester for Economic Policy Coordination, Employment and Social Aspects in the Annual Sustainable Growth Strategy Survey 2022. Amendment number 11, rejected. Number 2, rejected. Amendment number 3, rejected. Amendment number 4, rejected. Amendment number 7, approved. Article number 2, part 1, adopted. Part 2, approved. Article 3, approved. Article 3, parts 2 and 3, approved. Article 5, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Part 3, adopted. Part 4, adopted. Article number 8, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article number 9, adopted. Article number 10, part 1, adopted. Part number 2, adopted. Part 3, adopted. Article number 11, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Amendment number 10, rejected. Article number 14, adopted. Article 15, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 16, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 19, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Amendment number 1, adopted. Article 23, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article number 25, adopted. Amendment number 8, adopted. Number 5, rejected. Article 30, part 1, adopted. Part 2, rejected. Part 3, adopted. Article number 35, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 36, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Part 3, rejected. Article 37, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article number 40, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 42, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 43, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 49, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Article 51, part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Part 3, adopted. Part 4, adopted. Part 5, adopted as well. Article 52, Part 1, adopted. Part 2, adopted. Part 3, adopted. Part 4 adopted. Part 5 adopted. Article 53. Part 1 adopted. Part 2 adopted. Article 56. Part 1 adopted. Part 2 rejected. Article 62. Part 1 adopted. Part 2 rejected. Amendment number 6 adopted. Number 9 rejected. Recital H, Part 1 adopted. Part 2 adopted. Recital M, Part 1 adopted. Part 2 adopted. Report by Simona Bonafè. Batteries and waste batteries. Committee block adopted. Amendment 500 rejected. Number 84 adopted. 490 rejected. Amendment 127 adopted. Amendment 491 rejected. Number 135 adopted. 492nd rejected. Amendment 140 adopted. Amendment 493 rejected. Amendment 144 adopted. Amendment 494 falls. Amendment 162 Part 1 adopted. Part 2 adopted. Amendment 498 falls. 495 rejected. Amendment 164 adopted. Amendment 496 rejected. Amendment 178 Part 1 adopted. Part 2 adopted. Amendment 190 adopted. Amendment 499 falls. Amendment 237 till 261 and 263 till 269, all these amendments adopted. Amendment 501 rejected. 262 adopted. Amendment 502 rejected. Amendment 273 adopted. Amendment 503 rejected. Amendment 277 adopted. Amendment 323 adopted. Amendment 333 adopted. Amendment 504 rejected. 397 adopted. Amendment 505 rejected. Amendment 324 adopted. Amendment 506 rejected. Amendment 419 adopted. Amendment 497 rejected. Amendment 429 adopted. Amendment number 6 adopted. Next, Grace O'Sullivan Report, General Union Environment Action Programme to 2030. Vote on Provisional Agreement adopted. So the first reading has been finished. Single vote on the report by Marianne Wind, a new EU strategic framework on health and safety at work, post-2020. Adopted. And no final votes. Proposal for a decision pursuant to Rule 207 of the Rules of Procedure, setting up a special committee on COVID-19 pandemic, lessons learned and recommendations for the future, adopted. Proposal for a decision pursuant to Rule 207 of the Rules of Procedure, setting up a special committee on foreign interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation, adopted. Proposal for a decision pursuant to Rule 208 of the Rules of Procedure, setting up a committee of inquiry to investigate the use of the Pegasus and equivalent surveillance spyware. Adopted. Report by Irene Tolleret and Gwendolen Delbos-Corfield. Gender mainstreaming in the European Parliament, Annual Report 2020. Adopted. Report by Chrysoula Zacharopoulou, EU Gender Action Plan number 3, adopted. Motions for resolutions, rule of law and the consequences of the ECJ ruling, adopted. Before moving to the debates, I would like to give the floor, pursuant to Rule 59, paragraph 4, to Ms. Moretti on the referral back to committee for the institutional negotiations. That concerns Ms. Bonafé's report of the batteries and waste batteries. I give floor to Ms. Moretti.
Excuse me, can you switch your micro one? That's okay.
Doesn't work. Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Following the vote on the amendments on behalf of the rapporteur, Mrs. Bonafé, I would like to request referral back to committee pursuant to Rule 59, paragraph 4, in order to start interinstitutional negotiations. Thank you.
Paldies par šo pieprasījumu.
Thank you very much. This request will be put to the vote after the vote on the Commission's proposal during today's first voting session. And now we will move to the debates. The next item on the agenda is Commission Statement, Transparency and Administrative Standards, the treatment of public access request based on Regulation number 1049/2001. I should like to remind members that for all debates of this part session there will be no catch-the-eye procedure and no blue cards will be accepted. Furthermore, as during the recent part sessions, remote interventions from Parliament's liaison offices and the Member States are foreseen. I would also like to remind you that the interventions in the chamber will continue to be made from the central rostrum. I therefore kindly invite you to keep an eye on the speakers list and to approach the rostrum when your speaking tone is imminent. I give the floor to the representative of the Question, Commissioner Ms. Jourova. You have 5 minutes, madam, approximately. There you go.
Mr. President, honourable members, thank you for the possibility of speaking on the transparency and administrative standards. As you know, transparency is one of the underlying principles of this Commission. The transparency obligation embraces several areas. One is public access to documents, but there is also legislative transparency and transparency of relations of the commissioners, members of cabinets and directors general with interest representatives. The interinstitutional agreement on a mandatory transparency register ensures a greater transparency of the relations of institutions with interest representatives. The Commission proactively publishes a wide variety of legal, policy, administrative and other documents on different websites and registers. Many are available on the Register of Commission Documents, Register of Delegated and Implementing Acts and other corporate registers on EUR-Lex. Last year, the Commission released a new version of the Register of Commission Documents, featuring additional search functionalities, improved user interface and proactive publication of new document types. In the second phase of this project, the Commission will integrate the Register of Commission Documents with other Commission registers, thus gradually transforming it into a single entry point for Commission documents. The regulation on public access to documents lays down the general principles and limits of the right to public access to documents and provides the means of redress available against the final decision of the institution, a complaint to the European Ombudsman or an action before the court. I would like to draw your attention to the 2 legislative proposals for recast of this regulation tabled by the Commission and which have been pending for a long period. The Commission does not see, for the moment, willingness from co-legislators to engage in a revision process on the basis of these proposals, and we remain fully ready to support further legislative and political discussions. In case there is no prospect for any further progress on these files, the Commission is also ready to propose their withdrawal again and come with a new, updated and holistic proposal adapted to the developing realities of the 21st century, considering as well the case law and the Ombudsman recommendations. In the meantime, the Commission is regularly analysing its administrative practice and, for example, currently we are working to develop a new portal and new IT tools. With this new portal and IT systems for submitting and handling requests for access to Commission documents, electronic access to European Commission documents, that's the name of the system, citizens will be able to submit their initial and confirmatory requests, see their ongoing and closed requests, receive replies electronically, no need for notification, search for documents disclosed to other applicants, manage their personal data, and so on. The system is expected to go live by mid-2022, so very soon. The statistical data for access to documents show a high level of transparency, as full or partial access is granted to a vast majority of the requested documents. The Commission receives a high number of requests for access to documents. Concretely, is 8,001 initial and 309 confirmatory applications received in 2020, more than any other institution. Transparency is thus part of the daily business of all Commission departments. The statistics from 2020 show that documents requested by citizens were fully or partially granted in 81% of the initial cases. Wider or even full access was further granted in more than 37% of the cases reviewed at confirmatory stage. This proves that the Commission takes transparency very seriously. The preliminary data from 2021 that will be presented in the forthcoming Commission annual report on public access to documents confirm this positive trend, as well as the high interest of the general public to obtain access to documents held by the Commission in the areas related to the pandemic or the resilience and recovery programmes. This data shows the commitment of the Commission to the right of access to documents as part of its overall transparency policy, including in the unprecedented pandemic situation. With regard to the transparency of the purchase of the vaccines against COVID-19, the Commission proactively published in the advance purchase agreements with pharmaceutical companies. We are also preparing a response to the European Ombudsman recommendation on the European Commission's refusal of public access to text messages exchanged between the Commission President and the CEO of a pharmaceutical company on the purchase of a COVID-19 vaccine. The Commission will provide a response within the deadline of the 26th of April this year. Honourable members, thank you very much for your attention.
Paldies, komisārs kundze.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. As first, we will have Tomislav Sokol. 2 minutes at your disposal.
Poštovani potpredsjedniče.
President, Commissioner, transparency of the administrative system is very important because it enables citizens to take decisions. The transparency of all political decisions is important, and inter alia, for the public to get access to documents of the European institutions, which in principle all of them should be available. But on the other hand, because of their sensitive nature, should be taken and approached with care. This regulation provides for the fact that citizens should have access to this data, but the institutions also have the right to limit that in certain circumstances. The current situation is satisfactory, but we have to take care that decisions are made in the most open possible way and the closest to the citizens. And we should see that the administration is now more accountable towards the citizens of the European Union. And I think that after all the facts we've heard today, we should commend the Commission for the way it is dealing with these things. Many questions were about the joint acquisition of vaccinations. The fact is that we got more vaccines for a better price, and also there was no bad competition between different states. This process can be qualified as having been successful. But there are some doubts, and these doubts should be clarified, but without taking into putting it in question the whole process. And I really want to have the results from the Commission about small and medium companies. There is one thing that is very important for this Commission, and that is that all citizens of the European Union had equal access to vaccines, which was very important.
Thank you, Madam Evin Insir. 2.5 minutes at your disposal.
Colleagues, in democracy lays transparency, because without transparency there is no accountability. Let me quote the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, herself back in 2019. If Europeans are to have faith in our union, its institutions should be open and beyond reproach on ethics, transparency and integrity. Yet 2020, the words seem to still be just words, because if the true will would have been there, we wouldn't have needed to call for a debate to demand access to what should have been an obvious thing to do. Be open with Commission President's conversation with Pfizer Chief Executive, regardless of if they are done via text message, email, letter, or even pigeons. The Commission President could have transformed her words from 2019 into actions in 2020 in order to pave the way for all our unions, institutions, and constituted a role model for the member state. But instead, she chose opposite. Being an advocate for rule of law and democracy means to understand the importance of public access to documents. This is because in a functioning democracy, the public power requires the trust of people. Public access enables the citizens to exercise control over the administration. Public access allows for civil society and journalists to exercise a fully fledged scrutiny over society and its functions. By allowing transparency, we build citizens' trust and confidence, and we combat undemocratic ideas and powers. There is a clear link between a high degree of transparency and a low level of corruption. This is because transparency allows us to detect corrupt practices and prevents it. Public access to information means preventing corruption and creating trust. To achieve trust is truly a challenge for a union with approximately 450 million citizens in 27 states. This is important and something we must be mindful of, because transparency is only resisted when governments is seeing it as a threat, and transparency is only a threat when we have something to hide. The Lisbon Treaty clearly demands more transparency in the EU, and especially so in legislative procedures. Transparency is what citizens have the right to demand and what the EU has a duty to deliver. Colleagues, the time is now to update the Union's legislation on access to documents. The current legislation is 2 decades old and need a thorough makeover to provide our citizens with their fundamental rights. Thank you.
Paldies. Nākamā runā.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Sophie Intveld. 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Commissioner, colleagues. Transparency is essential for accountability, and accountability is the cornerstone of democracy. Now, the Commission pledges allegiance to transparency, and indeed we have laws in place, but we all know that the practice is an entirely different one. And I happen to be a veteran of access to documents requests, and I can tell you the Commission is actually, and the Council are actually not practicing a culture of transparency. They go out of their way to avoid transparency. And it's not only the Commission and the Council. If you look at Frontex, which is not only refusing access to documents, but then making applicants pay for expensive external lawyers that they've hired. And then we also see that the European Council is taking over more and more of the legislative work of the Council, so that a growing chunk of decision-making is moving back into the black box. Now, let's get to the case at hand here. The European Commission has its own wrong interpretation of the transparency regulation. And this is not me considering that. This is considered maladministration by the European Ombudsman. And the European Ombudsman knows a thing or two about transparency. Yesterday, a Dutch newspaper called Follow the Money disclosed internal papers from the Commission legal service and other services that show that the legal service had already warned against the Commission interpretation of the transparency regulation, saying that the definitions were insufficiently precise. So the Commission knew, but it chose to ignore those warnings. Now, if we cannot trust the guardian of the treaties to be open to scrutiny, if the guardian of the treaties is deliberately, knowingly misinterpreting the transparency rules, how can we trust them? Now, there's been the case of the text messages exchanged between President von der Leyen and Mr. Bourla, and I think it is high time that President von der Leyen confirms if they have been deleted, yes or no. And to those who start to hyperventilate about the confidentiality of commercial negotiations, you should know the transparency regulation, okay? I recommend everybody reads it, because the fact that those messages are considered a document officially doesn't mean that they will automatically have to be published, but they must be open to requests for access. Now, if the President doesn't feel that she is accountable to the public and to this House, I would like to know how we can trust the Commission to manage the spending of 450 million euros on weapons in the near future. I'm all in favour of the military support to the Ukraine, but I also think that strict scrutiny is in order. Now, President von der Leyen also happens to have a past as defence minister, where she ran into the same trouble with an exchange of messages that she deleted, so she should have known better. Incidentally, I think President von der Leyen should have been here. There seems to be a pattern of avoiding debates where awkward questions may be asked. I think that is a contempt for democracy, it's a contempt for Parliament, but one last remark, we should do also more as a Parliament. We cannot outsource parliamentary scrutiny to the ECJ or to the Ombudsman or the Court of Auditors. We have to hold the Commission to account. Thank you.
I thank you. The next speaker is Daniel Freund, 1 minute 30.
Liebe Kolleginnen, sehr geehrte Frau Kommissarin Jourová, ich sehe...
Dear colleagues, Madam Commissioner, I see that you have your mobile phone within reach and you've probably written a couple of messages already today. We all do. And I think the same goes for the President of the Commission. You know, she has to be reachable. And like all of us, the President of the Commission uses her mobile phone to contact colleagues, her team, to have an important exchange of views, to be involved in politics. And we also know that she used her mobile phone to organize the purchase of vaccines for 450 million citizens in the EU and to improve their lives. But what happened on the phone of the President of the Commission is politics. And now the Commission's legal service takes the view that text messages basically do not contain any important information in relation to Commission activities. Well, is she using her mobile phone just for Candy Crush then? I'm not buying it. Access to documents is a central fundamental right in any democracy, and journalists can't be fobbed off in relation to requests for information. And the Commission is now even ignoring the European Ombudsman. And access to central documents can't be prevented simply because certain text messages have been deleted. No, we need transparency in relation to what happened on the phone of the President of the Commission.
Thank you. Alessandro Panza is next. 2 minutes.
Grazie Presidente, Commissaria.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Transparency at a high level of the institutions is not just a institutional duty and matter of ethics, but it also casts aside any doubt. Transparency over the biggest crisis the European institutions had to face is an absolute necessity, and I think the European Ombudsman was thinking along that way with regard to what she said about the text messages exchanged by high-level officials, saying that transparency is an absolute duty. There's been a lack of transparency, and every time we've seen a lot of credibility. From WikiLeaks, we see the financing of the one laboratory, and a lack of appropriate documentation has been provided. We need to see the COVID vaccine contracts with the major pharmaceutical houses of the world, but these were mainly redacted. Now, in dealing with an unprecedented political and social crisis, there was an incredible effort. We cannot allow any doubt, and the doubts over text messages are not just about whether they existed and what they contain, but demonstrating the Commission is above any hint of suspicion, so that there can be no speculation as to the lack of transparency, or even worse, think that commercial interests, perhaps with China, are being put ahead of European citizens. President, we owe this to the victims of COVID and the families who have suffered and are still suffering the consequences in health and economic terms of the pandemic. We owe it to all European citizens. I conclude, President, it's always said that this is the house of the European citizens, but it should be a house of glass, allowing through light. There should be no space for shade at all. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mark Botenga. 2 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Well, we've all heard the Ombudsman talking about bad governments. In fact, we discovered something else. Not only during these negotiations between Big Pharma, Pfizer and the European Commission, not only did the President of the European Commission send little SMSs to the directors of Pfizer, but in addition to that, the more text messages she sent, the more the prices went up. We pay more for the current dose than we did for the first one. So this is what happened. SMSs sent out during the negotiations, and prices went up. Surely the purpose would have been the very opposite. Therefore, potentially, I'm wondering, is the Commission actually leading us up the garden path? Is it actually organising a kind of hold-up by basically, giving these favours to Big Pharma, to these individuals? And that's why we now talk about this regulation, the regulation that demands that the public shall have access to these documents. I mean, you're supposed to represent European citizens. These European citizens should be entitled to ask for access to documents, in whatever form, whether it's a hard copy, paper, whether it's an electronic copy, whatever. And this is what citizens are asking for, and you've answered. What have you answered? You've said, no, sorry. This access for the public would not apply to messages which are ephemeral or of short duration. You've said no. I mean, I'll acknowledge it's a good argument. It's a cynically brilliant argument. By being ephemeral, these messages can be deleted. You have the right to do so. I think it's a sign of bad faith, I'm afraid. I'm sure we'll never find out what was in these messages ultimately. We can talk about this, we can talk about rules, but rules serve no purpose if you have no genuine will to apply these rules, to abide by these rules, to abide by the spirit and the intention of the rules that we're talking about here. So what you're saying to people, and I think this is very serious, is that basically we can't really trust you. European institutions, you know, they've found a loophole. They're able to avoid transparency, and I can assure you, you'll have a hefty price to pay for that.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ivan Vilibor-Sinčić. 1 minute at your disposal.
Transparency and public access to documents is on a low level in Europe. Corona crisis, unfortunately, showed that to us very clearly. It failed with purchase agreements for COVID vaccines. Why cannot we, as MEPs, have access to purchase agreements? First, it was in a committee. We in any committee had a chance to see the agreements, but not allowed to scan, copy, take a photo, or tell anybody about it. This is ridiculous and humiliation of members of European Parliament. Then it was really published, but it was published in a redacted version, leaving everything important covered in black ink. In the end, we have text messages between CEO of Pfizer and President of the Commission, and even European Ombudsman had to take action on this. One could get an impression, following the media, that they are more in a friendly relationship than in a professional one. Instead of being a role model, the Commission is clearly mocking the citizens.
Thank you. Now I give floor to Jiří Pospíšil for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say a few words on the topic. From a general topic on the transparency of EC documents, we've gone to a specific case. I would like to thank the Vice President of the Commission, where she described the efforts of the Commission to make more processes more transparent, to improve the public portal, etc. However, what it's boiled down to is the discussion about the purchase of COVID vaccines and potential SMSs exchange with the manufacturers. It's not about transparency only, it's about a political culture. We should not debate whether we should disclose or not disclose SMS messages of a high-ranking politician. Rather, there should be no such SMSs. These contracts should be negotiated in transparency through official meetings rather than through SMS. I don't, as far as the regulation of 2001, as we know it, in my opinion, is sufficient. The question is about its implementation. If there are doubts, those should be interpreted in a restrictive rather than extensive manner. Besides the case we've heard about, we find it also relevant to discuss the case of our ex-Prime Minister, where there was an audit underway and it was never disclosed, even though it was in the public interest to disclose it. So the exemptions should be also looked into. That exemptions were actually treated rather extensively, not stricto sensu. So it's about the implementation that we should look at.
Thank you. The next speaker, Kathleen van Bremt, for 2 minutes.
President, Madam Commissioner, let me start off by saying that halfway through this debate, it's become pretty clear that the large majority of this Parliament feels that the application by the Commission when it comes to the transparency regulation is not something we agree with, and it has to be clear that we want to see change. And let me just